All right, welcome to the our New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for tonight, Thursday, October 6th. Tonight we have author Dan Levitt. Dan is going to be talking about his brand new book called Intentional BALK. Um, just so you know, uh, Dan is going to be talking about this book in a lot of different places, so it's an honor to have him here tonight. And I especially picked this date because it's a couple of days after the shot heard around the world. And a lot of people feel that the Giants might have done some illegal activities for that. So Dan will be talking about that as well. Next week, we have Rob Garrett. Rob is completing his book on Charles Stoneham, which will be out next year. And he'll come and talk about that when it is published. But he's really here next week to finish up the ownership group of the Giants from when the Giants moved to San Francisco in 1958 to the present day ownership group. I received a letter today from Mario Aliotta. I'm going to read it to you. I thoroughly enjoyed being asked to participate on the New York Giants Preservation Society recently. What a great group of fans we have. We have so much in common. Thank you for all you do. Hope to see you at some point in either New York or San Francisco. See, Steve, he says he hopes to see me. See the difference? you're muted, Steve. I also sent out a lot of stuff this week about the shot heard around the world and Willie Mays' health. And I spoke to John Shea. John wrote a great article about that. I posted that on Facebook, and I'm telling you, we have had so many positive responses on Facebook. And just so you're aware, I never put these Zoom meetings on Facebook to invite people. And the reason I don't do that is because there's like 2,600 people. You don't know who's who, and I'm very leery of somebody ruining Dan's time or whoever else the speakers. This way, it's kind of controllable. You know, I've met some great people on the Facebook page. Joe Goldfarb is here. I reached out to him, and he's been on a lot, and I think he's enjoying it. But I'd rather it be this way. I think it's just a safer way to control things. So anyway, without any further ado, I'd like to bring Dan Levitt aboard. Dan spoke about this book before it came out, and now it's a finished copy. And Dan, the floor is yours. Congratulations on getting it published, and it's out in the stores. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. The floor is yours, Dan.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it. It's fun to be here. It's fun to be here as a participant, and it's fun to be here as a chance to speak. So thank you very much. It's always it's always fun to be. There's always a great speaker on this. So Gary, it's amazing how you manage to line people up so often for this. I would just say, one of the things we get asked about, and I say we because I had a co-author, Mark Moore, about this book is, why did we write it? What did we find compelling about the world right now? And so the book is titled Intentional BALK, Baseball's Thin Line Between Innovation and Cheating. And one of the things that we found compelling is that all the different cheating scandals get treated very discreetly, whether it's steroids or sticky stuff on the baseball or the sign stealing or the roster issues that got John Capalella banned from baseball when he was GM of the Braves. Each one is sort of treated in its own silo. And Mark and I are baseball historians, and we wanted to look at, what's the context? Why are some scandals treated differently than others? Has the way we looked at this changed over the years? Cheating goes all the way back to the beginning of baseball. And so how has it changed in the nature of the cheating itself? And so we wanted to take sort of a more holistic book with the connections between the different types of cheating. And our book is broken into 10 chapters on various types of cheating. So there's a chapter on spitballs and spider tack, and there's a chapter on sign stealing with binoculars, and there's a chapter on cork bats, and there's a chapter on the playing field and how teams have manipulated the playing field over the years. But rather than sort of go through that, because you guys want to read it, or that's sort of a discrete way of looking at it. We have about 6 themes that run through the book, and I'd rather just sort of talk about the 6 themes here for a little while, and then obviously open it up to questions and thoughts, because obviously this is one of these topics that everybody has an opinion on, and there's not necessarily a right opinion. What we try and do to some degree is to lay out sort of the facts. What were the rules, you know, and you know, it was breaking this rule viewed differently than breaking that rule. So the first theme is that baseball and cheating have a long history together. As most of you probably know, right? I mean, baseball in the 1850s was when it became really a club sport, and it became competitive, and it mattered who won. When the, you know, unions were playing the Excelsiors, who won started to matter. And all of a sudden, as soon as you had that, you had ringers. You had teams cheating by grabbing players from other teams. Technically, a player was supposed to be on a team for 30 days before he could jump. That was rarely honored. Secondly, players were supposed to be amateurs. But a guy named Jim Creighton, who some of you may have, one of the early great pitchers, was rumored to be the first professional. Who knows whether he was or not? But of course, players are being paid by 1860 under the table. And it wasn't until 1868 that you were actually allowed to have professional players. But well before that, there were a lot of professionals. Anybody who sort of watched vintage baseball knows that in the 1860s, you had to pitch the ball underhand, generally with a straight arm. There were some kinds of different rules over exactly how you had to hold your arm. And players, obviously, pitchers quickly realized that if they raised their arm a little bit, they could throw harder, they could make the ball do more tricky stuff. 1872, the rules were changed to allow pitching up to the waist. You could have your arm up to your waist. So what did players do? They started hiking their pants up higher so that they could get their arm up higher and get a little bit of an extra angle on the ball. So this idea that cheating is somehow new, I don't think surprises anybody, but when you actually start looking at it, it's fascinating about how far back it really goes. And the other thing that is, I think, unique about baseball, is I don't know that there's people in baseball cheat more, but there's more rules to break. I mean, if you think about a basketball game on the court, there's only so many things that you could probably do that were against the rules. In baseball, there's, rules around pitching, there's rules around batting, there's rules around fielding, there's rules around the playing field itself that can be, where's the batter's box, where's the pitching rubber. There's just a lot more stuff, that you can think about rule breaking. And then the other thing about the rule book, John McGraw basically said, my job is to find a loophole in the rules and exploit it. And I can usually get 6 months to a season, or half a year to a full season before other teams have caught up to me. And so the rule book has gotten really big because it keeps trying to close all these rule loopholes, which of course then just makes more opportunity for rules to break. One interesting thing, looking at cheating, is that it's everybody. It's players, it's managers, it's front offices. There's stories of owners, trainers, groundskeepers. Just talking about the Giants, some of you guys may know the story, but in August of 1962, the Giants and the Dodgers were in the pennant race. The two of them were playing, and there was a game. The game was in San Francisco, and the Dodgers obviously had Maury Wills, who was going to set the stolen base record since broken that year. Willie Davis was a great base stealer. And so Matty Schwab, who was the groundskeeper for the Giants, talked to the manager, and they dug out the area around first base, took the dirt away and filled it up with peat and sand and water to make it basically like a swamp. And the next day, the Dodgers sort of recognized what was happened. They talked to the umpires. The umpires made Schwab sort of take the stuff out and replace it. Schwab's son has since said that they basically replaced it with the same stuff that they had in it in the first place. And so you had basically this swamp with peat and sand and water around first base. And so, essentially the Giants stopped the Dodgers running game. The only base that was stolen in the game was actually a third base, because you couldn't get a jump off of first. And what was interesting too is that the Giants voted Schwab a full World Series share from their World Series receipts. So you can see how much, you know, they valued Schwab sort of helping on. Also, it's supposedly during the playoff games themselves, Schwab was doing his magic on the base paths to try and make it so that the Dodgers, to slow down the Dodgers running game. The second theme is really around the fact that competitive people will always seek some sort of advantage, legal or otherwise. You need to remember, I mean, sort of obvious when I say it, but the people playing professional baseball or any professional sports are the 1% of the 1% of the most competitive people we've ever met. And they will basically do anything they can to win. And the next thing you realize is there's sort of an implicit cost benefit analysis to cheating, that players and people engaged in baseball don't really look at cheating as a moral issue. They look at it as sort of a cost benefit analysis. Is, you know, if I get caught, how good is it? You know, the cheating, how much does it help me? And if I get caught, what's the penalty? And, you know, George Bamberger, the longtime Brewers manager and pitching coach and Orioles pitching coach, and then of course the Mets manager for a couple of years, basically what he said was, we do not play baseball, we play professional baseball. Amateurs play games. We are paid to win games. There are rules and there are consequences if you break them. If you are a pro, then you often don't decide whether to cheat based on whether it's right or wrong. You base on whether or not you can get away with it and what the penalty might be. A guy who cheats in a friendly game of cards is a cheater. A pro who throws a spitball to support his family is a competitor. And, you know, I'm not saying that this is something that all players subscribe to, but clearly for among players at this level, it's an idea of how do I win, not is there some sort of larger moral issue around this. And what we have found is that when the penalties don't match the benefits is when we have the chaos. So steroids in the 1990s, there was this perceived benefit of taking steroids, and yet there was no way to catch anybody because there was no testing. And even if you did, there weren't really any penalties in place for it. So that's one issue. You know, another one that I like to talk about, and we can talk about this later too, is the sign stealing during the 20th century, which obviously, you know, for the Giants in the second half of the 51 season, there was no rule in the 20th century against sign stealing with binoculars. Everybody thought that it was wrong. And we talk about sort of this consensual ethic, which is kind of like unwritten rules, but without the unwritten rules connotation. But there was no rule against it. And when people complained about it, other teams doing it, the commissioner or the league presidents would basically say something along the lines of, gee, that's really bad. You know, we probably need a rule about it. If, you know, Ban Johnson really early on was saying, you know, we would crack down on it because, you know, Ban Johnson could do whatever he wanted regardless of whether or not there was a rule. But for example, you know, when some of the managers complained to Will Harridge, who was Paul Richards, he was with Baltimore, and he thought the White Sox were sign stealing. And of course, in the 50s, pretty much every team was sign stealing. And he complained that the White Sox were stealing signs, and Will Harridge basically told him, there's no rule against it. And even if there was, I don't know what we could do about it, you know, because if there was a big machine out there, how would we get the umpires to stop them? So the binoculars thing, that's part of the reason there was all these controversy for many years, because there was no rule against it. And when the benefits don't match the penalties, that's when we, you know, run into those kind of controversies. I would argue a little bit about the spitball as well. There was no player that was ever ejected between Nelson Potter in 1944 and Gaylord Perry in 1982. No one was ever suspended. You know, they were given the suspensions. And so you end up with this, you know, whether it's, you know, Preacher Rowe or Whitey Ford, there's, you know, everyone's sort of got these suspicions, but nobody's really, there's not really any penalty to it. And so it's not unnatural that these pitchers are trying to get away with it. You know, one interesting story continuing with the Giants a little bit, is that Al Worthington, who was a relief pitcher for the Giants during the 50s, he actually complained to Bill Rigney in 1959 that the Giants were stealing signs, and he was a fairly religious guy. And he basically said that, you know, it violated his religious principles and the Giants should stop. And in fact, Rigney stopped, which is sort of surprising when you think about it. I talked to Worthington probably a year ago, and Worthington said, you know, Rigney was a friend of his, and he felt like a lot of the Giants players really weren't that into the sign stealing. Well, the next year, Worthington was on the White Sox, and the White Sox gave him a very different reaction. I'm going to read you some of the quotes that he got. So he complained to manager Al Lopez, and Lopez said, I told Worthington I couldn't tell him whether we were doing it or not. As a player, it was none of his business what we were doing. But I did say, show me in the rule books where it's wrong. So Worthington next goes to GM Hank Greenberg. And Greenberg told him something fairly similar. Baseball is a game where you get away with anything you can. You cut corners when you run the bases. If you trap a ball in the outfield, you swear you caught it. Everybody tries to cheat a little. And in fact, Greenberg in his autobiography talked about sign stealing in September in the 1940 season when the Tigers won the pennant. Well, Worthington, you got to give the guy credit. So he goes to Bill Veeck, who's the owner. And Veeck, you know, in perfect Veeck ease, says to him, who do you think bought the binoculars? He then goes and says, this is Veeck, I tried to reason with him. I said, look, you cheat when you throw a curveball in a sense. Then I thought about his curveball and I realized he didn't. So perfect Bill Veeck, right? But it's just interesting that, you know, I mean, obviously Veeck was a guy was a competitor, and they wanted to, Worthington, his credit, actually quit and went back home to Alabama. He came back a few years later, and he was a pretty good relief pitcher for the Reds and then for the Twins. At a party at the end of, I think it was the 1963 season, the Reds actually gave him as a gag gift a pair of binoculars. So there was a couple of quotes that Worthington was sort of viewed as sort of an odd guy, but on the other hand, you know, obviously he got along with his teammates pretty well if they were, you know, having fun with him a couple of years later. Another theme goes around the fact that it's similar to this, that the people who are at the forefront of innovation, sort of the most creative people, are also a lot of the people that are stepping over the line. Branch Rickey is a perfect example of that. Branch Rickey invents the farm system in the 20s, and by the late 30s, Judge Landis is releasing 74 players out of the farm system because what's he doing? He's called covering up, where he's illegally keeping players under who should be allowed to advance. He's, you know, assigning them illegally between various teams. He's got the Cedar Rapids team that he owns, and through that proxy, he owns multiple teams in the same leagues, which is obviously illegal. So you're looking at a guy here in Rickey who's incredibly creative, but he's also then pushing it over the line. Bill Veeck, we talked about, another incredibly creative guy. Here he is sort of enthusiastically embracing sign stealing. Another case, you know, most obviously more recently, like look at the Houston Astros front office. In 2017, when the team wins, there's books being written about them. This is the team of the future. This is the way we're supposed to think about baseball. These guys are inventing a new way to play. And in fact, I mean, I think, look, I'm not disparaging them that way. They've been to 5 straight ALCSs and, you know, three pennants. So they obviously are doing something right. But the point is that they're being very creative. They're also pushing the line and cheating with the sign stealing. And just one comment on the sign stealing. People look at the Astros very differently. I mean, obviously, if you live in Houston, you feel differently about it than if you live in LA. To me, there was sort of this demarcation line, September 15th, 2017, because that's when Manfred came out and he made his Apple Watch ruling, and he penalized the Red Sox a little bit. for signaling into the dugout. There was a trainer in the dugout who was wearing an Apple Watch, and they were doing some signaling to him over what pitch was coming, but they weren't necessarily relaying the pitch directly to the batter. It was if a guy was on second base, they'd try and relay it through the guy on second base. Anyway, in Manfred's ruling on when he came out, he sent a note to all of the teams basically saying, this is my penalty on the Red Sox. And oh, by the way, we're going to be a lot more strict on this going forward. And there's going to be penalties. I'm going to hold the general manager and the manager liable. And so to me, the fact that, you know, the Astros were sort of caught subsequent to that memo, to me sort of says, you know what, there's something maybe a little different about the quality of that sign stealing versus, or no, the quality of the crime versus what came before it. Again, you know, we all have our various opinions on the Astros, but there were rulings along the way that said that to me at least say not all sign stealing is equivalent. There was actually the Phillies in 2010. There was a fairly similar case where the Phillies players were looking at, were using the video room. Obviously, they didn't have the replay monitor at that point, and relaying signs to the dugout. It was complained about, and Major League Baseball investigated, and they basically, it was really the only time a team has ever been warned before sort of the Red Sox scandal. And Major League Baseball said, you know, gee, I don't think there's anything going on here, Phillies, but make sure you don't do anything. So at that point, that was the first time that I've seen that anybody actually got significantly warned for sign stealing. And, you know, I think part of the reason that people didn't make a bigger deal out of it for Manfred is that Bud Selig was fairly nostalgic about it. I mean, there was one quote around this time where he basically said, you know, when I used to go to Braves games as a kid, I remember Adcock and Matthews and Aaron, they were getting signaled what was coming. So he was more nostalgic and laissez-faire about it, I think. And once Manfred came in, I think there was the sense of, you know, it's time to do something about it. The fifth theme is really around that innovations from outside baseball will tempt people to cheat. And the example I really like is that modern prism binoculars were invented in Germany in 1894. By 1899, the Phillies were using them to steal signs. And it was the next year, it was a fairly extensive sign stealing. They actually had a buzzer system similar to what the Giants used, where they had Morgan Murphy, the backup catcher, out in center field, and they installed what's called then a telegraphic sounder, which is just a piece of equipment used in telegraphy, but that would buzz under the third base coaching box, and he would buzz Pierce Childs, who was at third base. My understanding, and it's, you know, it's not all that clear anymore, but that there had been some amusement park activity in the ballpark over the summer, that they had allowed amusement park to use it, which is how some of these electrical wires had been put in. So it wasn't that the team put them in; they took advantage of this sort of electrification that was already there. But you know, you can see it didn't take long for that invention to go to someone trying to figure out how to use it to gain an illegal advantage. And one of the, you know, just one of the interesting things to the reaction is that the owner of the Phillies, Colonel John Rogers, basically said, "This is okay. You know, it's your job to catch us. It's not our fault." Other owners were much more, you know, were complaining about it. Other NL owners. Now this was 1900. They were actually going to have a conversation about it at their winter meetings, but once the AL declared that they were a major league, there was a whole lot more stuff for the National League to worry about than whether or not there was sign stealing going on. And so they pretty quickly sort of let that controversy go away to reappear many more times throughout baseball. And I gave a presentation at the Sabre Convention on sort of the history of sign stealing throughout the 20th century. And it pretty much just went on all the time because, again, there weren't any penalties against it. Van Johnson, to try and get people to stop complaining about it, said, well, if I catch anybody, we're going to throw you out of the game. but oh, by the way, if you complain about it to me, I'm going to fine you. So people pretty much stopped complaining about it as well. You know, another good example is spider tack. You know, spider tack, which is the sticky stuff that pitchers use. One of the fascinating things around spider tack was it was invented for the World's Strongest Man competition. So about 2010, 2011, World's Strongest Man, one of the things you have to do is you have to carry what's called these Atlas stones, these giant stones. And so these weightlifters invented the sticky stuff to put on their fingers so they could carry these stones better. And about 2015, 2016, they said, you know, we started getting these orders from major league clubhouses, and you know, we had no idea why we were getting these orders. Well, eventually they figured it out. And it's not just the spider tack that's the invention that goes to the problem today versus, you know, Whitey Ford or Gaylord Perry, but it's also the fact that we have this high-speed video, the Rapsodo machines and the Edgertronic machines and these pitch laboratories, so that you can not only are you using the sticky stuff, this really good sticky stuff, but you can know exactly what the pitch does in terms of horizontal and vertical break and, you know, spin rates and all these high tech numbers. So you're really designing pitches. You can watch how it comes off of your fingers. And, you know, it's not, you know, Whitey Ford putting on, you know, how much Vaseline should I put here and throwing it to Yogi and having Yogi go, yeah, you know, try a little more Vaseline to the right. I mean, this is much more sophisticated. And I think that's part of the reason we look at it differently. And partly it's because some of these pitches are almost unhittable if you don't somehow rule against this. But the idea that, just to go back to the idea, is that if there's an invention out there, people will figure out how to get advantage of it in baseball. And a lot of times that's stepping over the line. Another obvious example is PEDs. You know, steroids came to baseball much later than to other sports because for a long time, people felt that weightlifting and muscle in baseball was not beneficial, that you wanted flexibility. You know, one of the early teams to start doing weight training, not steroids, but just weight training, was the Big Red Machine in the 70s. And once other teams then sort of got into the weightlifting, I think it wasn't that far removed that people figured out that, you know, steroids, once you're trying to put on muscle mass, that steroids would be beneficial to that. And so again, an innovation from outside the game that benefits, that gives an advantage, and especially when the benefits clearly outweigh any associated penalties. So lastly, you know, we talk a little bit about the reaction to cheating and why it's different for different penalties, and what are some of the things that have changed over the years. And the first thing that I'd like to mention is the deception of the umpire. When I say deception of the umpire, this is, you know, you trap a ball, you hold it up and you say you caught it. It's Derek Jeter, I don't know what it was, 10 years ago, when he faked getting hit by the pitch and he, you know, went to first base, and there was a whole lot of controversy around that at the time. It's the neighborhood play at second base. You know, you could argue that it's pitch framing by the catcher. Two things. One is most people believe that deception of the umpire, it may be technically cheating, but it's not wrong. You know, I think from the time we're all playing Little League, you know, you're taught that if you trap a ball in the outfield, you hold it up as if you catch it. And if you trap it and the umpire rules a catch, I don't know anybody who's going to hold it up and say, no, I didn't catch it. Or maybe there's a few people who will, but it's not very common. Once the umpire came into baseball in the 1850s, before that, baseball was basically a gentleman's game and call your own. Once there was an umpire, I think most players, spectators, believed that it was the umpire's job to catch you, and if you can get away with it, more power to you. One of the things we do in the book is we talk about sort of doctrines, and we try and use players to state some of the stuff that, you know, some of these theories, because they've either written about it in their books or they've talked about it for the record. Keith Hernandez talked about this at some length. He said, it's not cheating if, you know, it's the umpire's job to catch you. It is cheating if you're doing it sort of in the back room. He was making a difference between the spitball, which he said it's the umpire's job to catch you, and say a corked bat, which there's no real way to catch a corked bat. And so that's worse in his way of thinking than a spitball. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I'd also say that all of this sort of deception of the umpire has really gone away with the instant replay, and probably for the better. But all of the historical deception of the umpire that we've talked about forever is really gone away. I mean, you guys probably remember the Todd Frazier play from 2018 when he was on the Mets playing third base. There was a pop fly into the stands. He reaches over to grab it. His hand sort of disappears below, and he comes up holding a ball. Then he flips the ball back into the seats. And, it turns out that he had just picked up he hadn't caught the ball. He had picked up just a ball off of the seats. It wasn't even a regulation ball, held it up, got the out call, and then flipped it to the kid. And, generally that was laughed about. Nobody really held it against Frazier, although I think he said he actually caught it and dropped it and then picked up another ball. But clearly that stuff is generally viewed as okay. We laugh about it and move on. And I think the fact that instant replay has taken a lot of that away is probably good. Again, pitch framing is probably the last one we have here, and that may go away if we end up with an electronic strike zone. Relative to things like PEDs and drugs, one of the interesting stories that I found was the first drug scandal in baseball was in 1951. It came out that Hal Newhouser had been taking Novocaine shots in his shoulder. So Newhouser, as you guys all know, the great Tigers pitcher in 1945, he was the MVP of the American League. The Tigers won the World Series, and he was taking Novocaine shots in his shoulder in September and during the World Series. And for about 3 days, this was a giant story. And some of the headlines were things like, Tigers dope their way to World Series. And other headlines were much more benign. It was like, Newhouser gets Novocaine shot. And this debate had died out after about 3 days. And then there was sort of more drug controversies as we went on. But to me, what was clear from the conversation around this was that people were generally okay if you're using drugs or medical procedures to get back to your natural state. So cortisone today, or Tommy John surgery, which is, taking a tendon out of your wrist or your leg and putting it in your elbow, you're sort of getting back to where you were. And that's viewed differently than something that takes you kind of beyond your natural state. The most obvious thing there is PEDs. And I would say there's a big gray area there. Some people believe there's a very defined line there. Other people look at a more gray area and don't have the same issues with PEDs. But clearly there is some sort of dichotomy, and that's what's going on there, that if you're sort of coming back to your natural state, it's okay. If you're somehow enhancing your natural ability, that's not. I think this goes around this idea of the purity of athletic competition, and that, our goal is to see the very best against the very best. And if you artificially enhance that, give one side an unfair advantage, that somehow detracts from our ability to enjoy the natural, competition of the world's greatest players in whatever sport we're watching. And I think a lot of that you can see coming out of this debate around Novocaine with Hal Newhouser in 1951. And remember, you couldn't dope horses at the time, and so that was part of the argument too. That was there, and that part of the argument obviously is long gone. But that was another part of the conversation at the time. Just a couple more things. Intricacy and sophistication and complexity, I think, go into this. When something's kind of masterminded, it feels different. So the Astros was clearly sort of a masterminded thing, where it wasn't, somebody out in the center field fence looking through the hole, waving a green towel or a red towel. It was recruiting interns, and it was multiple players engaged in it. And I think that there's a different feel to that. Whether or not that's legitimate or not, I don't know. But I think clearly the same thing with Spider Tack and the high-speed video that we were talking about versus Whitey Ford or Preacher Row spitting or putting Vaseline or Gaylord Perry doing something to the ball. the other thing is that we talk a lot about, there's been various front office scandals. So John Capalella of the Braves was banned for life, 4 or 5 years ago for illegally signing foreign players. There was a cap on how much you could pay foreign players, and he was sort of illegally funneling extra money to them. And Manfred, I think, made it was either 13 or 16 players free agents. And that, he was banned for life. So clearly baseball took it seriously, but I don't know that after the Braves won the World Series last year that people were saying, Braves, you're cheaters. It was only 5 or so years ago that you were illegally bringing in players. I think roster manipulation just has a different feel about it to people. And the reality is that roster manipulation is probably makes more difference in who wins or loses maybe than things like sign stealing or spitballs. I mean, there's no scientific way to know that. But I think clearly that roster manipulation, another thing we talk about is Chris Correa, who was the scouting director for the Cardinals. And as many, he hacked into the Houston Astros database in about 2013. And the FBI got involved, and Correa was actually sentenced to 46 months in prison, which of course will stop anybody else from doing it. You talk about costs and benefits. But, my point is that the Cardinals are fined a couple of draft picks, but there's no way that there's sort of this ongoing, this ongoing hatred of the Cardinals in the same way that there was this sort of ongoing opprobrium towards the Astros. And then the last thing I would just say is, did it work? I think that if the Astros had lost in the division series back in 2017, I don't know that we'd be talking about this. Even if this came out, how much would we be talking about it? So I think that's part of it. I think cork bats would be a bigger deal if we all thought that it really made a big difference. There's been some studies of cork bats, and they're fairly ambiguous. They all sort of say we didn't find anything. That doesn't mean you can't, does it, the fact that it's lighter, you can swing it harder, but then of course it weighs less for when you hit the ball. And the science that I've seen basically is fairly inconclusive over what a cork bat works. I think if cork bats really made a difference, or if there was a way to illegally do something to a bat that was undetectable by the umpires, it would be a much, much larger deal. So, Gary, thanks again for having me. That's the book. Hold up a picture of it if anybody wants to order it.
Yeah, Dan, what would be the best way to get the book?
So our website is, the book's called Intentional BALK, and our website is intentionalbalkbook.com. And at the website, there's links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and then there's also a link to a website that'll order it from your local independent bookstore and ship it to you so you can support them as well.
Can you hold up the book again?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have this on my mirror. I should probably change that, but
great cover.
Sort of read that backwards. Yeah.
I'm gonna start the questioning. Just one thing. If you're gonna ask a question and your question is answered, and somebody else is then asking the question, it's inappropriate to interrupt that person who's talking. So please, whoever has the floor, ask your question, you'll get your answer, and then when I call on somebody else, please don't interrupt the other person. It's not the right thing to do. Dan, 2 quick questions. One, what was your inspiration for doing this?
Well, again, I've been wanting to do a book. And the other thing that I would say is that Mark and our other 2 books were on, one with the last one was called In Pursuit of Penance, which was really how front offices were built, kind of the history of front offices, and how did smart front offices, what were they doing? And as part of that, we've always been interested in sort of what creative things the teams do to get ahead. And as we were sort of looking at these cheating scandals, particularly the sign stealing and then the spider tag, we were kind of thinking, around Jeff Lunau, in the book In Pursuit of Penance, it came out in hardcover in 2015, and we came out with the paperback in 2018 with a new epilogue. And in it, we talked about Luna and how smart he was and all the stuff the Astros were doing. And then you kind of realize, well, gee, you know, sometimes these guys take it over the line. And so as the cheating stuff started to come out, we just felt that we had sort of a broader and interesting perspective to add to the question.
Thank you. My other question is, unfortunately, I have not read the book yet. The spider tack. I've seen pitchers come out and say the most bizarre stuff, like Tyler Gassnow, I believe. I can't get a grip on the ball without using it. When was it legal to put stuff on the ball? I'm very confused.
I don't think it was ever legal to put stuff on the ball. I think, you know, they rub this mud on it. And baseball, so you guys probably all know this, that they get this mud out of the Delaware River, and all new Rawlings balls are rubbed with this mud. And supposedly that's to give it a better grip and yet still keep the ball white. Baseball has tried to work with Rawlings, which I think they own a part of, to make the ball so you don't need to rub it with this mud so that it's naturally more sticky. But they haven't yet, and I know that they've tried several times, been able to do anything better than the mud. So I don't know, you know, maybe it just has to do with these, you know, the baseballs are new too, right? I mean, the baseball's different now than I think it was a couple of years ago. So maybe it's just that the new ball the pitchers think is a little bit slippier. I don't know. It was never legal to put stuff on the ball, but you can use the rosin. So you're allowed to use, you know, people sweat on their hands and they use the rosin bag. I mean, that's what's supposed to do it. But Gary, I mean, it's a good point, because I don't know. I think it's just an excuse to say we want to use spider
I'm
tack.
not saying he put anything, but it sure sounded like he was saying, hey, I don't have control anymore because I can't put anything on the ball. But we'll save that for another time. Let's go to Mars. Mars, you're up. And then Harvey and Ed.
And me.
Hi, Dan. Thank you for joining us. Well, after the 1919 scandal, fast forward to the steroid era, do you think that Bonds, McGuire, and Sosa and Roger Clemens records should be stricken or put in a separate category, a la the asterisk that they first bestowed on Roger Maris until that was removed? What's your opinion on that?
So let me, I'll answer the more substantive question second. So we don't really deal with the 1919 White Sox. We define cheating as things that can help your team win, not things that sort of go against the grain, but aren't to help your team win. So the same way we don't talk about the collusion in the 80s by the owners, because that again was more of an issue around salaries, even though it was, you know, found to be against the rules. It was not something that was done to win. It was done to reduce salaries and probably actually hurt your teams by not signing players. You know, as to the other, I'd say this: my problem with the steroid area is we don't know, right? The Mitchell report came out, and when the Mitchell report found was the people who had already been publicly acknowledged, or that they, you know, when they found a few, and then there was a couple of trainers, you know, people associated with teams who talked about people associated with those teams. And they basically have said, I feel bad for these people because they got named, and all the people on the other teams whose trainers or clubhouse people weren't forced to talk, they aren't exposed. And so, you know, I mean, I've heard numbers of anywhere from 10 to 50% of people were taking steroids. I have no idea whether it was the low number or the high number. I'd like to think it was towards the low number, but because we don't really know who was taking them, I'm reluctant to start saying this guy was guilty and that guy wasn't, because we don't know all the people who we, you know, who may have been taking, but no one ever named. Now, you know, obviously Balco was a little bit different because there's sort of more of a story around that. You know, and I think there's very different stories around each person, right? I mean, McGuire, I think, you know, McGuire's acknowledged his use. Someone like Manny Ramirez has failed the test twice. You know, Clemens has denied it, and in a court of law, when he was charged with perjury for it, he was, you know, found not guilty. So I'm not saying he didn't do it. I mean, there's obviously evidence, or he wouldn't have been there. But I just think each case is a little bit different. And my take is if baseball wants to make ruling, that's fine. But I don't feel like I know enough to be able to make to start saying this guy should be in and that guy shouldn't, and that record should be good and that one shouldn't.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Mars. Before we go to Harvey, one of our people have to leave. Perry, did you want to quickly ask something?
Perry, you're muted.
Perry, unmute.
Hi, sorry. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I got to jump off to get on the Sabre ballpark figures Zoom. So thanks, Dan. I am very interested in the subject of cheating, as you may well imagine. And thank you for refraining from casting aspersions on umpires in general, because we are there to uphold the integrity of the game. And I think there had been a very few isolated instances of umpires being fired or being caught taking bribes. But if you think about it, the effect that would have on a game overall would be very minimal, even if an umpire did deliberately cheat, because, I mean, who's to say if the cheating would be any more egregious than simply getting calls wrong? You know what I mean? So anyway, thank you very much. And I like the beard. I didn't see that at Sabre a couple of months ago. It's looking good on you. So,
Well,
and
thank you.
hi, everybody. I've missed being here. I had a very busy summer, so it's good to be back.
Thank you, Perry. Harvey, you're up.
Dan, I want
Frank,
to,
I'll put you down, Frank.
Dan, I want to make get into the PED discussion. I actually had this discussion with a number of my friends in, of all places, Yankee Stadium some time ago. The old Yankee Stadium, that'll place it. And I was the only Giants fan wearing my replica Giants hat. And it was around the time Barry was pounding home runs at a prodigious rate. And one of my dear friends, and by the way, this group is an unsavory group. We're all lawyers and ex-prosecutors. And as a matter of fact, one of my dear friends, now he's retired as a former state Supreme Court judge, and he was hammering away at me. He kept saying, Barry cheated. Barry cheated. And I said to him, how did Barry cheat? Everybody knew he was using steroids, and I didn't disclaim it. There's a great book, I'm sure you've seen it, called Game of Shadows, which proves beyond any doubt that Barry was using steroids or PEDs. And my friend Dick Lowe says to me, Barry cheated, Barry cheated. I said, but they all knew he was using. He wasn't cheating. He was trying to win. He was trying to hit home runs to advance his team to try and win games. So Dick says to me, I said, Dick, what was he cheating about? Dick says he was cheating about the sacred records. My God, the sacred records. I said, what would those be? Of course, I knew what he was saying. 714, 60, 61, 755. Hank had said 755. I said, oh, yeah, Dick? How many home runs did Josh Gibson hit? And Dick looked at me like I was crazy, but I am crazy, but it's kept me from going insane. So I said, Dick, how many home runs did Josh Gibson hit? Of course, the answer is we don't know. There's anecdotal stories that he hit 800 home runs in the Negro Leagues, but we never got a chance to add those up. He never got a chance to play. He was cheated out of a career. So when you talk about cheating, I don't know. They were cheating. They were trying to win. I don't like Clemens, but he was trying to win. I like Barry Bonds. He was trying to win. I'm biased. I'm a Giants fan. But the comment of Barry was cheating just struck me as crazy, because the whole issue of the Negro Leagues and the whole issue of the color line, which is something I'm sure you didn't deal with or couldn't deal with. But that to me is where the real cheating was. And I just want to add something on a lighter note. the Astros cheating to beat the Dodgers in the World Series, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that.
That's good.
Thanks,
no,
Dan.
I appreciate your comments. You know, I mean, I would just say that the problem with the 90s was that it was cheating in the sense that you weren't allowed to take things that were federally banned drugs, and steroids as of 1990 were on the federal banned drug schedule. I think they were a Schedule 3 drug. And so by taking them, that was not allowed under baseball rules. So I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm not trying to nitpick. And I understand that obviously the color line was a lot more egregious than somebody taking PEDs. But again, that was, Ricky was bringing, he brought in Robinson to win. I mean, the crazy thing about the color line is that it actually hurt teams' ability to win, which is sort of what is so. But I hear what you're saying, and people just need to make their own judgments on it.
Thank you, Dan, and you're welcome back. It's good every time you show up. It really is.
Thank you.
Dan, you got a fan club. Ed Freer, you're up.
Yeah, Dan, very informative, very informative. I liked hearing about Al Worthington too, a name from the past. My question has to do with, I'm always concerned about the naivete of all the gambling that's now coming into baseball. In fact, they got commercials where they're showing gambling on every pitch. Have you uncovered much evidence of cheating to lose or to throw a game? And are you concerned about it?
Well, so let me say this. We did not look at cheating to lose. We were looking at cheating to win. I would just say, just sort of having looked at this in general, I'm not sure my opinion's any more interesting than anybody else's on this, but that with the way we can bet now, it's changed the way that you could theoretically influence somebody. It's not 8 men out. You don't have to somehow get to 8 guys and throw a game. If there's a relief pitcher that, maybe you need money and it's the 7th inning and you can bet on whether or not he's going to walk somebody in the 7th, there's a lot more vulnerability there if you're looking for an opportunity to do something illegal than prior to this sort of being able to make a discrete bet on pretty much anything that happens in baseball. So that would be the only comment I would have.
That's my concern, is for the good of the game. Well, you didn't uncover too much then on that.
No, we didn't find any, we didn't look for it, but any sort of gambling scandals.
Okay, well, thank you again. I did enjoy it, especially Al Worthington.
Thanks, Ed. Frank Lewis, you're up.
Dan, it's been a great show. Have there been any cases of, is sign stealing limited just to the home teams, or the visiting teams do it too?
No, there's been visiting teams doing it. I'm not sure that I'm going to have the right game, but Whitey Herzog, I think Raleigh Fingers in a game in 1976, Royals A's game. Raleigh Fingers had a pair of binoculars out in the visitors bullpen and was signaling. And this was one of the few times where someone actually got an umpire to do something, even though there's no rule against it. Herzog got Joe Brinkman to go out there and make Raleigh Fingers put the binoculars away. And I'm pretty sure that Fingers was in the visitors bullpen at the time. So that's the one. So, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was other times where, depending on where the bullpens were, or would be able to sort of cheat from the road and make a signal.
Thank you.
The man with the dulcet tones, Mr. Taylor, you're up.
Dan, terrific presentation. Thanks very much. I look forward to reading your book. Quick follow-up on tackiness on the ball. My understanding is Major League Baseball is looking at Japan, that the baseball they use over there in NPP it has a natural tackiness to it, and they're examining how it's made with the idea of maybe incorporating that over here. What I was curious about, though, the minor leagues have always been, from players of stories they've told me, the wild, wild west as far as sign stealing and trying to fool umpires. Did you by any chance have the time to be able to look into the minor leagues as much as you looked into all the big league stuff, which I'm sure just filled your plate?
You know, we didn't. There's one story in the book that's pretty funny, and I'm going to forget who it was, what game it was, but there was an umpire who was kicked out of a game, and he, you know, excuse me, a manager who was kicked out of the game by the umpire, and you know, they all want to try and sneak back in, and he dressed up as the mascot and came back onto the field as the mascot, and eventually he was, you know, somebody gave him away later, and he was suspended for a game, but that's really the only sort of minor league story we had.
If I can share, Bob Burris, who's he's a Sabre member, and his dad for many, many years owned the minor league club in Denver, shared a funny story a while back. Bob ran the manual scoreboard in Mile High Stadium when his dad owned when he was a teenager. And particular season, Billy Martin was their manager. And Billy was staying with the family, and Bobby told him one night, you know, from my perch in the scoreboard, I can see the catcher's signs. And he said Billy Martin just flipped out. He went crazy. And I guess Tulsa was coming into town, and Warren Spahn was their manager. And Billy said, I really want to stick it to Spahn. And they came up with this plan where Bobby would flip the hit sign, the hit light for a fastball, and the error light for a breaking ball. And he couldn't remember the score, but he said it was like 25-1 or something. And Martin was giddy after the game.
That's a great story.
Thanks, though. Great presentation. I look forward to getting your book.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Charles, welcome back. You're up.
Yeah, actually, being a Giants fan, I did have a question. You know, everybody knows that Gaylord Perry threw a spitball. My question is, any thought of how much he threw it, and was it more psychological to mess with hitters, you know, put it in their mind that he was going to throw it, or, you know, in terms of as a percentage of how much of the time he threw it?
You know, I don't really know. You guys all know he came out with the book, Me and My Spitter, where he said he used to spitball, and then he got a bunch of pushback, and he came out, I don't know what it was, 6 months later, and said, sorry, I was just kidding. I really don't throw it. I just use it to psych out hitters. You know, if you read you know, there's probably, we probably read 20 umpire books as part of this. I mean, every umpire read an autobiography we read, and every one of them said they thought that Perry threw the spitter, through some sort of a Vaseline or spitball. You know, and they all said that they, you know, always were trying to catch him and they never could. It wasn't until 1982 that somebody actually caught him in the act. So my sense is that he threw it fairly often. I mean, obviously there was one test we talk about in the book. I think it was Lee when he was in the American League. I think it was on the Indians, and the Indians got Perry and Lee McPhail. They did a demonstration for umpires of a slider to show how it broke. That the slider broke just like a spitball. So, you know, I mean, and it did. So it could be that he didn't throw it all that much, but you know, any umpire book you read that where the umpire was umpiring a game that Perry pitched, you almost always will talk about Perry. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think he threw it.
Kind of, sort of. Thank you for the answer. I'm looking forward to reading your book too.
On Zoom.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Judge, you're up.
Thanks, Gary. Dan, I want to follow up on an issue that was raised earlier, I think by Perry, but about the umpires. Do you have any cases of a front office or somebody trying to influence an umpire? I have a little different view. I think if you had the home plate umpire in the bag, I think that could very well influence the game. And if I'm just wondering if you had any examples of that, and if not, why not? I'm surprised that owner's general manager, somebody wouldn't have tried that somewhere along the way.
Well, we haven't found any examples since the 19th century. There was a couple examples in the 19th century. There was one, I'm forgetting the guy's name, and it's in the book, but I mean, it was against the Detroit then Wolverines, and they were complaining that he had taken a $200 bribe from the other team. And I think that if you look at sort of the stories around it, it's probably the case. So I think was probably going on. But I think it was much more in the Wild West days of the 19th century. We did not find any examples of anyone bribing an umpire and getting away with it. Well, of any public of anything where there's come out that anybody bribed an umpire since 1900.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. I also look forward to reading the book and then buy it.
Thank
Sounds
you.
good. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions for Dan? Renee, you're up.
Dan, great to have you back. I missed you too. The little talks we used to have. This is a fascinating book. I'm really interested in getting this book. I found it also interesting, the little history you put together, what players thought was cheating and others who, you know, did it for the win of the game. I found that I'm sorry, my cat. You know, when I go to work, you know, it's, you know, you do what you got to do and that's it. But in sports, I mean, I had my high school years and stuff like that. And, you know, there's always somebody going to do something or the team's going to do something to get an edge. You know, hoping that an umpire doesn't catch you, you know, maybe take an earlier jump on a fly ball to get across if you don't have any wheels or not. You know, there's always an edge you're looking for. And it's for what you just said, simply put, to win a game. Very fascinating. I can't wait to get your book. Also, you said something that was really interesting. And it's interesting how during the steroid era, everybody was going after players. And I get it, you know, you're going after them, but it's been going on for so long, but you didn't go after the managers. You didn't go after the owners who were reaping the benefits of the turnstiles. You know, if you're going to go after one, you got to go after everybody. I found that interesting too. That was my take back then, and you bringing up Bill Veeck and others trying to do, you know what I'm saying, made me think of that again. Again, thank you for the presentation, and I can't wait to get your book.
Appreciate it. The only thing that I would add about steroids in the 90s that complicates a little bit is that the owners, you know, right? I mean, the players' union, until sort of there was the pressure of the government to do something, there was no way to get testing, and that's really the only way to stop it. That's on one side of the ledger. On the other side of the ledger, I would say that the owners could have done something with minor leaguers. In 1993, many may remember, they banned tobacco for minor leaguers. And they could have theoretically tried to do something similar with steroids in the 1990s. It wasn't until, I think, 2001, that it was either 2000 or 2001 where baseball sort of started doing testing of minor leaguers for steroids. So it's true they couldn't have maybe done anything in the major leagues, but they didn't, where they did have an opportunity to do something, they didn't do it.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Dan? Dan, I got to tell you, fabulous. Again, we wish you nothing but great success with your book. And can you hold it up one more time and tell us the best way to get it?
Sure. It still comes up in your review. I can maybe, well, by the time I figure out how to change that, it'll be too late. But again, you know, if you any order from any of your independent bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, our website is intentionalbalkbook.com, and there's click-through links to all three of those spots.
Dan, thanks again. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful night, everybody. I'll be in the room to close it down.